Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022. It's a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon here on the East Coast of the United States. Our guest today is a Judging Freedom regular, Phil Giraldi, career intelligence agent and expert on the American intelligence community, and generally a critic of American foreign policy and the use to which American intelligence has been put, and a personal friend and a dear friend of the show. Phil, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
So, what is the story behind? I mean, it's kind of died down now, but 3 or 4 days ago, it was hot news. President Zelensky's claim that a Russian missile, which attacked a grain silo in Poland and killed 2 Polish farm workers, was sent there by Russia. What is the story behind it? As I understand it, it is true that a missile did hit a silo in Poland, but after that, whose missile it was and how it got there, I don't think there's any evidence to back up what Zelensky claimed, is there?
Well, I would say, first of all, the fact that the story has disappeared tells you everything you want to know about it, which is that it's being suppressed. This was a monumental error in judgment, however you want to put it. I would call it very simply a deceitful false flag operation, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the missile that landed in Poland was a missile that's in the Ukrainian arsenal. The Russians don't have them; they don't use them. So the visual, the material evidence would be that it was a Ukrainian missile. Secondly, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the United States all have considerable capabilities at tracking these missiles and knowing where they were going in the war front there in Ukraine. And Zelensky started immediately claiming it was a Russian missile, and this was certainly against any evidence that he could have been provided with by his own military. And then went on to say, now this is the killer for me. He went on to address NATO to say, look, this is a violation of Article 5 of NATO, whereby any NATO member who is attacked, everyone, all other NATO members have to support by engaging potentially in hostilities with the attacker. So that meant a major war with Russia. And he came up with this immediately. And then Joe Biden weighed in. Actually, he was in Indonesia and said, no, this is not true. We don't have any evidence to show that this was Russian.
Well, so it probably, you can take the story from there. Don't let me put words in your mouth. Was a Ukrainian false flag, probably authorized by President Zelensky. So he was dumb to authorize it, and even dumber to think that NATO and the West would buy it.
Yeah, and the thing is, why I call it a false flag is because obviously this is changing. This was a Ukrainian missile that did the damage, and he's trying to misdirect it to make it Russia. And so that is a classic false flag. And in this case in particular, some of his apologists here in the U.S. are saying, oh, well, the missile probably malfunctioned or was an accident. But no, that's not what he said. He was saying quite the contrary. This was a Russian missile. And the fact is that even if it was an accident, he should have fessed up right from the beginning if he were being honest, which he wasn't.
It's hard to believe that a Ukrainian missile used for defense purposes somehow ended up in Poland.
Right.
It's more rational to believe that the Ukrainians destroyed Polish property, invaded Polish sovereignty, killed 2 Polish citizens in an effort to suck NATO into the battle, and it didn't work. And their apologists in the West, as you pointed out at the beginning of our conversation, have dropped this story from common conversation because they don't want to embarrass their boy Zelensky. Do I have a handle on this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. Several other individuals that you probably know quite well, like myself, were are quite critical and cynical about this whole process have noticed the immediate drop off in the story in the mainstream media when it was determined that our good friend Mr. Z was lying. And
So American intel, for once, told the White House the truth.
yeah, I think this was something that was you couldn't weasel your word around to get away from. The truth was there's physical evidence in terms of the tracking information that shows where this missile came from and where it went to.
So how does American intel get this information? Does it have agents on the ground at the farm where the silo was hit, or is this done digitally?
Well, in a sense, it's done digitally. A lot of this information is collected from satellites. The Russians have them up. The U.S. has them up. The Ukrainians would have had detecting equipment on the ground. But the United States and Russia both have satellites that are in orbit and covering that area all the time. So they had, physical evidence showing this missile taking off from Ukraine and going to Poland.
Got it. Now, wouldn't President Zelensky's intelligence services have told him that he can't pull off this kind of it's not a prank because two people died, this kind of a crime, and then blame it on Russia that he'd be caught?
Well, I think the short answer to that is that Zelensky has done a couple of house cleanings on his staff and on the military. And he probably has mostly yes men. And let's also realize he also has, I'm sure, some American neocon advisors who are in and telling him what these policies should be. There are also, of course, we've discovered in the past week, confirmation from the Pentagon that there are indeed boots on the ground. Now, people like me have known there have been boots on the ground under civilian cover inside Ukraine. That means American soldiers not in uniform, in civilian clothing, and sometimes tied to relief organizations or something like that as a cover. And these people have been there since the war started.
Let's talk about the aid to Ukraine. The day before or the day after Biden, for once, did the right thing when he was in Indonesia and said, there's no evidence that this came from Russia. He had just released another $37 billion in aid. Now, I assume that's part of the $60 billion package. I don't think it's 37 on top of 60 because that would have to come from Congress. But whatever its source, 37 billion is a lot of aid that he released. Is this in cash or in hardware?
It's both. It's a part of it is dedicated to relief efforts and to so-called humanitarian efforts. But a good chunk of it, I think, about a third of it or more, is dedicated to providing new military equipment. So yeah, you're right. I suspect it's all part of some of these other big packages that have been voted on and that are still kind of floating out there and providing money. But the problem is the government at a certain point has to make a decision. I mean, obviously this is a quagmire, and Zelensky's behavior suggests that he's going to do anything in his power to bring the U.S. and NATO into the fighting. And they have to decide if that's an American interest. And if it's not an American interest, it's time to, pull the plug.
Well, I suppose that depends on who you talk to. I mean, you and I and the people watching us now are convinced it's absolutely not in American interest. But people like Lindsey Graham, who never met a drop of somebody else's blood that they didn't enjoy seeing, would say it is in American interest and we have to stop Putin before he goes another inch. But I want to talk to you about the cash. Is there any evidence that this cash is going to sources that have nothing to do with relief for the suffering civilians of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, this is somewhat connected with the recent scandal with FTX, where money has disappeared And the FTX organization had actually a bureau in Ukraine where it was funneling what it called funds for relief in Ukraine into the country. Curiously enough, this organization was actually visible on the internet, and it was shut down 2 days before there was the bankruptcy. So the conclusion that some friends of mine have drawn is that money was coming from the United States. It was not being audited. It was not being checked out as it arrived in Ukraine. This money was then used uh, to buy FTX, and FTX melded its own money with this money, and so in a way you have American taxpayer funded money that wound up back in the United States when FTX contributed to primarily Democratic politicians.
Oh, wait, I don't get this. First of all, don't tell me that Vladimir Zelensky and Sam Bankman-Fried are buddies.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that. I mean,
Wow.
if you have a mechanism set up in the Ukrainian government by this speculator, then you would have to assume that they kind of know each other, at least in an institutional way. They're supposed to appear at the end of the month, the two of them, on a New York Times panel in New York City, and they're going to be apparently talking about something.
All right, so money comes from the federal government and it goes to Ukraine and it's laundered by FTX, and some of it ends up in the coffers of the Democratic National Committee. Some of it must end up in the coffers of the pockets of whoever in Ukraine permitted this laundering, permitted FTX to even be involved with this.
Yeah, that's right. The objective would be to keep Democratic politicians, congressmen who might be growing a little cool on sending all this money to Ukraine, to keep them happy and mellow. So that's why to the tune of $80 million is what in the last election cycle just completed is what FTX gave to the Democratic Party.
And you're a friend whose name I won't mention. He's also a friend of mine. He can out himself when he wishes, although he's a tough guy who doesn't fear being outed. Suggests that the origin of this money is the federal treasury.
Yeah, that's the cute part. And you know, Senator Rand Paul and others, and Tom Massey have been trying to get this money at least audited, at least kind of checked on when it was arriving in Ukraine. But this has been resisted by the Democratic Party in the White House.
Every time Massey in the House, Tom Massey in the House, and Rand Paul in the Senate offer amendments to have the aid to Ukraine audited, it doesn't even come up for a vote. I guess we now know why.
Right.
Wow. And I'm going to guess also that your former colleagues somehow are in on this. The CIA must know about this, and they must be looking the other way.
Yeah, CIA was certainly has again boots on the ground. They've had them there right from the beginning. The extent to which they're tied in with a lot of this stuff, I have no idea, but it's certainly plausible.
How many CIA operatives do you think are on the ground in Ukraine, and how many American military in civilian garb are on the ground as well?
I would suspect we're talking about hundreds. I would think that the probability is we're looking at maybe a battalion size organization, 600 to 800 people.
So where do they live? Do they stay in a hotel? Do they live in tents? How could hundreds of soldiers show up in another country dressed like this, and the press and the locals don't know about it?
Well, obviously, again, this gets to the issue of cover. I mean, the cover would be provided by organizations that are being set up as cover organizations, and they would come with their own survival packages. They would, in many cases, yes, they rent hotels and apartment blocks and things like that. This is all kind of run out of the embassy, although again under cover of not speaking openly about it. And the embassy, of course, has all kinds of arrangements. It had its own housing in Kiev. It had a lot of resources on the ground that could be plugged into.
Are they armed, these intelligence agents and these civilian garbed military?
Depends on the cover. If they had cover designations that plausibly would allow them to carry a weapon for self-defense, then they would be. Otherwise, they would probably hire local guards for that kind of security, and that way that it kind of keeps their profile a bit lower anyway.
And are Russian intel and Russian military aware of all of this?
Of course, Russian intel no doubt monitors the telephone conversations and just about everything else that goes on inside Ukraine.
So if there's corruption going on in Ukraine involving Sam Bankman-Fried and Vladimir Zelensky and eventually Democratic politicians back in the U.S., Vladimir Putin probably knows about it.
Yes, he would know about it. The real question is, where does this go from here? There's, of course, this is like the story of Zelensky's attempt to get World War III started, where the media shuts down on it. And I have a feeling that we're going to see the same thing with FTX. The media is going to shut down on it. They're not going to really be too interested in going after the Democratic Party connection to all this cash flow.
Well, there's a bankruptcy going on in Wilmington, Delaware. And of course, Sam Bankman-Fried is no longer in management. There's new management in there. And the lawyers for new management earlier today in the Delaware courtroom pointed a finger at Mr. Bankman-Fried and says he has a lot of answering to do because there are billions of dollars unaccounted for. Would be very interesting to see if our mutual friend is correct and some of that money had been funneled through Ukraine. Philip, you can't make this up.
No, it's incredible.
Always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving to you and your family.
And the same to you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.